Welcome to the Living Room Disciple Podcast. I'm excited that you're here as me and Kelsey continue our conversation about the different political topics here in the United States and how we are formed by our political beliefs. But I do want to give a warning that our conversation today is related to abortion. So I know this is a topic that often brings out some of the strongest emotions in our heart, but I ask for a deep breath and not necessarily an open mind to changing your opinion, but an openness to what the Lord has to say to us today as me and Kelsey dive into this topic. It's tough, it's full of emotions, but that's actually the kind of place where we become more or less like Jesus, how we handle those emotions. So thanks for joining us today on the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home. Kelsey, can I tell you something?
Please.
So Nick and I have been praying that the Lord would send us another co-host for some time, specifically a wise woman. And when we were planning out the episodes that we're doing this summer, kind of helping us talk through politics, we knew, actually, one of our wives literally said, "You're not allowed to have that conversation, just the two of you." Because the conversation around abortion is very difficult, and it's one that I believe benefits most from opinions and perspectives that are wider and broader than just one. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like it needs, I think, a broader perspective to give it justice. But I need to apologize to you. I never intended for it to be your second episode.
Here we go.
Here we go. Welcome to the Living Room Disciple Podcast, Kelsey. Let's go into the deep end. Okay. But as usual, we'll go ahead and as we dive into these topics, the goal just for our listeners as a refresh is we're going to kind of do a high level of the topic. What are we talking about? Maybe a little what's the history? What are the different opinions as they stand today? And the Living Room Disciple does not tell anybody per se how to vote, but we're going to talk through what our heart postures can be depending on how we vote, because I really do believe the Lord cares far more about why we filled out our ballot versus the exact how we filled it out, what our heart posture was in the ballot box. And so, ready to dive in?
Let's go.
All right. Okay. So help me out. As it relates to abortion in the United States of America, how did we get to where we are today? Yeah.
Oh, man. So there's a lot more of the history than we can cover and stay at all, like within our time slot. And so I've tried to think about, in preparation for this episode, the points to just kind of dance on a little bit, or maybe it should be more like anchoring stones for thinking through this area of our culture. And I tried to straighten myself out by looking at a couple things online just to make sure that I was thinking of a timeline accurately. And I'm actually going to start with that experience before I go into the history itself.
Okay.
Because depending on the resource that you look at, the spin is quite obvious.
Yeah.
Even when you look at something like the National Geographic history on abortion, or of course, what some of the major news outlets might say is the history, and even PBS, what you notice in terms of the vocabulary used, and one of the major things that they emphasize is how long abortion has been a part of not only human history, but the history of our forming nation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that emphasis I really could see in those resources mentioned. It is being leveraged. That emphasis is being leveraged to try to justify where we are today in terms of the prevalence of it, the litigation that we have over it, the legislation that is being just promoted or that
Mhm.
has been that's being sought for it, to make it a part of our law, to codify it, as it were. So
Mhm.
we really see in the descriptions, even in the timelines that are given, just a real spin, just to repeat myself.
Mhm.
So I had to look at a couple different sources to try to navigate those waters and remind myself of some of those anchoring stones of history. And Focus on the Family actually provides an excellent, graciously iterated. Actually, there are multiple pages that are devoted to the gracious iteration of the history of abortion, not only in human history in general, but in history in the United States of America in particular.
Mm.
And one thing that struck me is that abortion was a part of the practices even of the Native American folks.
Mhm.
It was part of the practices of Puritan people.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, one of the governor's council members in Maryland, before it was even a state, coerced a woman, I believe her name was Susan Warren, into taking an abortive patient in 1652.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
it has a long history
Yeah.
and was one of those hidden practices, and that was commonly viewed as exploitative. So women knew that it was not something that was something to be proud of. It was a shameful thing,
Mhm.
and it was usually exploiting women, by men who had had an extramarital affair with them and wanted
Mhm.
to hide that affair. Well, many years down the line after this just was a practice that was hidden, known to be exploitative, and actually need to make mention that many of the original women suffragettes like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Blackwell, these women also recognized it as an exploitation of women and
Mm.
as a part of their work to promote women's engagement of culture through having the vote, through being present in what was going on in the leadership of a community. They called it heinous, and
Mm.
they were anti-abortionist in their
Mhm.
thinking.
Mhm.
They viewed it as a wrongful way of treating both women and children. And so women's and children's rights, both very much at the top of these women's minds. I believe Elizabeth Blackwell was even a doctor. And so
Yep.
she had a number of excellent things to say that I commend to our listeners, regarding just the moral, well, the immoral nature of
Mhm.
this act. Skip along
Yeah, yeah.
to the 20th century. This is another really key anchor point in terms of the history of abortion in the United States of America. In 1916, uh, Margaret Sanger really became a major proponent of abortion because of her beliefs in eugenics. Now, eugenics is a word that really needs a careful definition. And it also needs to be tied to some other key figures in our history, scientific history in particular. Darwin and his cousin, Francis Galton, are all intertwined in this thinking about eugenics, which is the effort to diminish inferior genes through careful reproductive acts. And I'm going to go
Mhm.
into that a little bit further. And also by elevating superior genes. And if that harkens back to some thoughts that we have from Nazi Germany, it should,
Yeah.
because Nazism was based on these wrong-headed notions of the superman, the overman, the one who has a stronger genetic code and whose genes should be the ones that are promoted throughout all of the earth.
Mhm.
Um, and it was racist, it was ableist, treating those who were born with genetic defects, with handicaps, or as we call it, disabilities, who would then go on to live with those disabilities, treating those folks as though they did not have the same right to live. And this is the deep and dark history of abortion in our society, where it went from that hidden practice to the modern day, and I should say modernist, because
Hmm.
20th century, earliest 20th century thinking was a modernist philosophical posture, where man's value, what we attributed to man as valuable, had to do with what they could do to perform, with their strength, with their beauty. It was very much defined in materialistic terms
Hmm.
and in naturalistic terms. So, materialism, naturalism, these philosophies that come out of and that danced around Darwinism.
Which
And
would be a way of saying,
yeah,
I think the way you're phrasing it, like there would be a way of saying like the value of a person is what they can contribute to
yes,
the economy or to society.
right. Absolutely.
Hmm.
So it became something that was much more at the forefront of people's thoughts around the globe. And the flavor of feminism changed in this
Hmm.
period too. So we talked about the suffragettes, this original kind of gathering of feminist thought, but first wave feminism that included famous figures like the famous five of Canada,
Hmm.
and another interesting thing called eugenic feminism, where these leaders in feminist thought, these women leaders, were proponents of even the sterilization
Hmm.
of women who were perceived to be inferior or to carry inferior genes. So just wreaking havoc on those that in their mind were less than,
Hmm.
and destroying people's lives with it.
Which I want to just point out because
Yeah.
I appreciate how we're going through the history, and I really appreciate the intentionality. I think sometimes we can develop a belief that this is something that exists in others and in the past.
Mhm.
And I know I'm going to bring up like one of these like silly points that sounds silly, but I really
We need some
mean
light.
it.
No.
Like I've heard jokes. I grew up in a home around others. Like I've heard plenty of jokes. Like when someone does something really dumb, somebody says like they shouldn't even be able to reproduce. Like what I mean. Like, and
Yeah.
it's a facetious way of saying they don't want that what they perceive as idiotic behavior to be
Mhm.
perpetuated. But the reflex to say that
Yeah.
is a revealing of a heart that I have. Like I, in my
Thanks for
own sin
bringing it there.
nature, can
Yeah.
see myself as, and this is going to be an important point for me as we talk through abortion. I can begin to see myself as superior, and
Mhm.
my ways as superior. And although I don't believe that I come from a part of history or society in which that superiority is based on gender or race, I'll use other metrics to
Yeah.
define my superiority. And in fact, I would even argue that in 2024 like the American political system, we would almost use our political beliefs to
Yeah.
indicate superiority or not or lack of superiority. Um,
Yes.
okay, so I just want to take that a moment just because I feel like if we're a listener, like we can think, okay, like this is all in the history books, but I think the
Yeah.
heart condition is one that will unfortunately perpetuate until the Christ comes again, because it
Yes.
exists in some capacity even in my own heart.
Yeah. I am sad to have to lend my amen to that. It's
Hmm.
absolutely true that this is the condition of the human heart apart from Christ,
Hmm.
apart from the
Hmm.
Spirit's work. In fact, it's a part of what we need to look at now, that I'm going to kind of pivot a little bit more into some further anchor stones,
Okay.
stepping
Okay.
stones, whatever we want to, whatever illustration I
I
land
like
on,
anchor
metaphor I land.
stones, by the way.
Anchor
Yeah,
stones
I'm
for
digging
the
that.
history. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
All
yeah.
right. They're anchor stones for the history. So we get into that modernist view. We move through many years of that before we start having this second wave feminism and a number of different things that come up with that. And we start seeing the court cases like Roe versus Wade.
Hmm.
And what I notice as I look at each of the four major court cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court, there was Roe versus Wade, there was Doe,
Hmm. Those are the only two I know
had-
about.
that well, there's also Casey, and then of course the Dobbs case.
Oh, a
So
recent up, yeah.
yes, so each of those, we can be more careful about naming them. In fact, I've got some notes here. I'm going to see if I can pull those
You are
up
so
really
diligent,
carefully.
and I
It's
appreciate.
oh, well, if I write it down, I remember things better, and I needed to grapple with it so it wasn't just
Mm.
ping-ponging in my brain, or pinballing is the better metaphor there. Pinballing in my brain, all these things. So Roe versus Wade, Doe versus Bolton, and then Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and then the recent Dobbs versus Jehu, which is the recent decision that we're all most familiar with. But in
Hmm.
each of these cases, what we notice, and this is where I'm going to tie it to the condition of the human heart as we even think
Hmm.
through this history, each of these things were either trying to mitigate abuse issues.
Hmm.
Um, again, the exploitation of women
Hmm.
is a big part of why some of this litigation happened, because women do tend to, and children do tend to still be those objects. They're the weaker object,
Hmm.
um, subject, not even object. That's
Hmm.
not even correct. They are subjected to, as a weaker individual and person, to much more abuse. And so
Hmm.
much of this litigation was supposed to relieve that burden of oppression from
Hmm.
the shoulders of those who had been raped, who had experienced incest, who had who had been abused,
Hmm.
who they were having to even go to their abuser for permission to end the life of a child
It's
in the
very
womb.
difficult
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
complicated and complex, and the
Right.
emotions are, I genuinely believe, unfathomable unless you've experienced them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Because for those of us who, women who are listening to this, obviously, we've spoken about the fact that I have 3 children of my own.
Hmm.
It is a very weighty thing. It changes our emotions, our perceptions, to go through the bodily experience, the embodied experience of having a child quickening in our womb.
Hmm.
It's a big
Hmm.
deal.
Yeah.
And so to experience coming to the end of your wits, of your strength, of to be brought to your lowest place is very, very possible, as the like seeing no other out besides
Hmm.
this. And that's, I'm not justifying when I say this, but I'm saying you have to be in a pretty low place in the first
Hmm.
place in many of these situations.
Hmm.
Not all of them, but in many of them, to be at a place where you might conclude this is my only option to end the life of this child in my
I,
womb.
I actually want to use that as a little launching
Yeah,
point. So as
I think that's
we
great.
I almost feel like it's silly to outline the two different sides of the abortion
Mm,
debate because I feel like they're so prevalent, but I'll just say
yeah.
them. Obviously, I think most people don't fall into the extremes, but of all the topics we'll discuss, we will find more people in these extremes than maybe most other topics. On
Sure.
one extreme, we have individuals who would identify as pro life that believe, on the most extreme end, that abortion should not be legal under any circumstances, but that quickly becomes more nuanced with allowing for certain exceptions based on conditions like rape, incest, um, and such. Um, and then life threatening conditions for the mother. So that's kind of like the one that's probably those most common stances on the pro life side.
Mhm.
Going to the other extreme would be the pro-choice, which in its most extreme form would be allowing abortion up to near um, due date of the child. That's really rare, even for supporters. Generally, it's allowing the termination of a pregnancy within the first 2 trimesters would be the most common stances. And the reason I wanted to lay that out is because what you were getting at just now, I think, is the most important part of handling conversations around abortion
Mm,
from a vantage point that I think honors the Lord, and it's doing it with what you were just doing, which is demonstrating a heart of empathy
mhm.
and not allowing somebody else's stance to excuse us into a lack of empathy.
Yes.
You know,
Mhm,
because I think that happens quite a bit. My personal uh, in my childhood, I grew up in a very pro-life home
mhm,
um, that was incredibly judgmental of individuals who did not share that viewpoint, and not just my home, but the church family I grew up in. I would say that's actually in my opinion, that's the common default posture of
mhm.
most church environments I've been
Sure.
in the communities that I've been in, mostly in the South. I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that's what everyone's opinion is. That's just my life experience.
Sure.
And I think one of the difficult parts of that is it's void of empathy. And when
Yeah.
it's void of empathy, even if we're holding to the right stance biblically, I don't think we're holding to the right heart biblically.
Yes. And there's so many other first of all, I'm just really glad that you're highlighting the need for empathy, but I want to say there's so many other shades to this than the
Hmm.
one who's caught in the particular traps that we've defined so far.
Hmm.
There are other traps, and there are people who are setting those traps.
Hmm.
And I want to start by way of confession that it is those folk like the Margaret Sangers, like the Famous Five, like our versions of that today, which is more of the postmodernist spin, which is almost like none of this really matters anyway. None of
Hmm.
this matters. It's just my choice that matters.
Hmm.
It's almost that existentialist idea, like we see wrestled with in Camus' work, in Sartre's work, that it's my choice that makes it valid. It's because it's an expression of me as a person that it
Yes.
has any value. But those are traps. And what I'm trying to say as confession is it's very difficult for me to actually have compassion or empathy
Mm.
towards those who set the trap, those who have
Hmm.
who have so fully swallowed the lie that it's okay for us to take this power and use it, that they
Hmm.
then are tempting others to believe that way, or helping them to justify action
Hmm.
that is, and I've used the word heinous already, I'm going to use it again,
Sure.
heinous action towards an image bearer.
Hmm. And actually, this is where I put a lot. This is, I think, where
Mhm,
my thoughts have been quite a bit, because one of the things that I experienced, uh, for most topics, I won't share my political views. Personally, I'm,
mhm.
I'm somebody who leans pretty heavily pro-life. I've actually been public about that. Um, so anybody with a quick Google search, I guess, will find out. But
Sure.
um, I think, as we delved into 2020 politics, I started interacting with a lot of believers who held differing opinions from me, but still very much love Jesus. And even though I never was convinced into their political beliefs, I think one of the things that I started to understand was our heart posture that I thought was really healthy. And if I'm really honest, this is actually the topic that probably spawned how I wanted to approach all of political topics in general. Um, and let me kind of indicate what I mean by this. So we'll talk about the pro-choice stance first. I do believe that if someone holds to pro-choice stance simply because there's an advocacy for one's own self and one's own good, that's always an anti-Jesus viewpoint. Christians, disciples of Jesus, do not hold our own good as the capital good in our lives. And
Yeah.
I think that's really difficult. And it feels really insensitive to hear from like this guy, right? Who's not a part of the conversation. It's not my body, right? That would be how people would phrase it. And I fully respect and
Mhm.
acknowledge that. But I would say that biblically, I can stand firmly on the fact that if I ever advocate for any political thing, simply because it's in my good and best interest, and we talked about this last time, we need to be focused on the good of our communities and our neighbors when we engage in the politics. So I think that's thing one. But one of the things I would hear from believers who did not have that perspective, but did hold to a political viewpoint I disagreed with, who were identifying in a pro-choice manner, is they viewed their political opinion as advocacy for women who did not have access to healthcare,
Mm.
for women who did not have access to safe delivery or safe pregnancies. Um, and they viewed that viewpoint as, yeah, I guess I'm repeating myself, but they viewed it as advocacy for the good of someone in their community. And this is where it could be easy for us to begin, not me and you, but for listeners to start saying, yes, but this, yes, but this, yes, but this. And I
Mhm.
just want to pause and say, even if we disagree, that is a heart posture that is good. Even if maybe the conclusion that they have come to, we don't agree with or find fulfilling. And that's where I stand personally. I just don't come to that conclusion. Um,
Mm.
but we won't talk about it in this podcast, but I will say this. But the willingness that I had to listen
Mhm.
actually ended up challenging me on a few other areas and made my personal pro-life stance far more comprehensive,
Mhm.
far
Yeah.
more empathetic,
Mhm.
far more considerate, not just of my moral compass for this one particular topic, but taking a step back and saying, what am I doing for the least of these in my community that would feel that they are coming to a place in which abortion is their only option?
Mhm.
And it was very challenging. And so I really appreciate in my own personal life those believers, those followers of Jesus who had come to a different political conclusion than mine, but who were willing to have a heart that I think was postured well. But I'm kind of putting this out here, Kelsey, and I want your opinion. I want your thoughts on
Yeah.
that. I don't know if you've heard that perspective before, or tell me your thoughts.
I I've been trying to sift that idea of the heart posture as the ultimate litmus test, for lack of a
Mm-hmm.
better word,
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
where the good is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to put that piece of it on pause because that's making a value judgment that
Mm,
I don't want it to be a snap judgment
yeah.
or even to be perceived as a snap judgment. Um, when you ask about, how do we perceive what somebody does from a correct heart posture, I can't help but think of so many of those stories that say it's for the greater good. Like, we're going to
Mm,
do this
mm-hmm.
for the greater
Mm-hmm.
good.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
they're thoroughly convinced that they are doing good or that they are working towards an ultimate good. And
Mm,
they're thoroughly convinced that their intentions are good, that their heart posture is right, but they are justifying all of the wrong things
mm,
through what they have presumed is good. And now I've been talking about that in a very general way. I'm going to
yeah.
put some specifics on this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's easiest to do that through fiction. One of the first
I
fiction
appreciate this so much,
things
by
that
the way. We were just talking about this the other day. I appreciate this.
about
Fiction
using
conveys a
fiction.
lot. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah. There's
it's
so much
so
that fiction speaks.
helpful.
Yes.
There's a reason why we were compelled by literature and why
Yes. I
I
agree.
almost minored in literature. I had other
Mm-hmm.
languages that were vying for my attention, but I know that you're
Mm-hmm.
an English lit major, right?
Well, actually, an
Is that
English
right?
creative writing major.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so but
Yes.
it's this
Oh,
love of
yeah. I took
story,
plenty of
and
literature, by the way, like so
yeah,
much. And I taught English for
story
a number of
helps
years.
us.
So I'm kind of pretty good.
Yeah, it helps us understand, and particularly when it's a book or a film or something that
Hmm.
we can watch from beginning to end, we can see how a worldview, as it were, how it actually works itself out
Hmm.
from, beginning all the way through the conflict until some kind of resolution or lack of good resolution. If we
Hmm.
see a worldview come to a bitter conclusion. So, depending on how listeners feel about Harry Potter has a great example
Hmm.
of a wizard who believes that he is working for the greater good. It's Grindelwald, I think, is the one I'm
Yeah.
thinking
I
of.
think you know that.
And he sucks Dumbledore into that way of thinking for a long time.
Hmm.
And I believe that Dumbledore's compassion, and then when he rears up with like just anger, like righteous anger, I think all of that character that has been built into Dumbledore is from actually failing and
Mm.
doing it wrong and getting it backwards. But another of my favorite fictitious stories, but it played out on the screen in a TV series, I've talked about it a number of times in other places, but is Person of Interest. And it's been around for a long time, but it was a story that followed an AI that was trained to do good to humanity.
Okay.
And then somewhere along the way, there's another AI that doesn't have that same coding and training. And you get these two godlike super AIs, super
Yeah.
intelligences, and they end up warring with one another.
Okay.
And the one is trying to
This is
save the
very
world.
intriguing, by the
And
way. I may
it
actually
is, it's
watch any of
such a
these.
good concept. It's so
Yeah.
good. The one ends up trying to save the entire world and every individual. And the other one is like, I'm going to save the world by taking out people for the greater good.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm going to repeat that. Like the one super intelligent, it's this God
Yeah.
who is willing to sacrifice others for its agenda. And
I'm.
then you have the other one that is a God that ends up sacrificing himself for
Hmm.
the benefit of others. And that helps us to define what good actually is. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. So I am tracking with you, and I think, and I see where you're going with that, right? Like I'm
Okay.
tracking the frame. I think the tough thing is, and I think it's difficult in abortion specifically,
Yeah. Yeah.
is but with everything, it really is tough with everything. Is we can't see the heart of a man,
No.
and that puts us in a quandary. And I think when we end up wanting to do is we want to look at the beliefs or the actions of a person and extrapolate their heart condition based off that, which we can do with limited success.
I agree. We
Yes.
cannot see it. And this will be an interesting part of the discussion. We started this about fruit last
Yes,
time.
yes,
All
yes.
right, keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but here's the key though, and this is my I mean, this is where I'm convinced today, ask me in a year, maybe I'll be convinced in a different way. So I'm still changing. But my current conviction is that a person's political stance is not fruit, but the way they treat other people is fruit. And there could be nuance there. I'm probably painting with too broad a brush, but I really believe this is the core truth. And it reminds me of really I'm thinking about the reverse. I know right now we're talking about, in a sense, we're talking about someone who's maybe holding pro-choice beliefs and kind of asking like if this is an antithetical belief system, how can a believer hold to that? But I would kind of say I think Jesus gives us a really good example of somebody who holds. I'm doing this in quotes because there's also a deeper conversation about the biblical stance on abortion, which the church has been divided on in the past. So I want to be clear that I have my own personal beliefs, but I stand in a level of humility to acknowledge that others have disagreed with me. Um, I'm thinking about Jesus, and you remember in this, it was the Sermon on the Mount. He says, bunch of people are going to do XYZ, and they're going to stand before me,
Mm,
and they're like, well, I did all this in your name. He says, I never knew you. And he kind of like rotates through all these different parables and examples throughout his teaching ministry. Another one that comes to mind is this tax collector who is a doer of evil
mm,
in the Jewish imagination would be a doer of evil. Symbolic of that, someone who's exploitative and uses people for their gain, and that person
mm,
stands before Yahweh on the outer courts of the temple and pounds their chest and says, Lord, forgive me for I'm a sinner. And the Pharisee is a doer of righteousness
right.
whose heart posture is just not in alignment with their actions. So the irony is we think of hypocrisy as like, do what I say, not what I do. But actually hypocrisy in the Bible, like when Jesus is using the word, is people who do the right things and say the right things, but do not contain the heart posture of that.
Right.
And I think that's the image in my mind that resonates is all. I'm not going to use other people. I'm going to use Phil. I'm For much of my life, I held a very firm pro-life stance and a very pharisaical heart posture. That my stance was indicative of moral superiority,
Mm,
and I never would have phrased it that way.
mm,
It just
mm,
came out in the little subtle ways I treated other people. And I think one of the things that really jerked me awake was, again, kind of what I alluded to earlier, is meeting someone who did not share my political stance, but was treating people far better than I was treating them.
mhm,
Not just
mhm,
in their stance, but in their posture, the way they treated. Now, I think the ideal, I want to be clear, I think the ideal that we all want is to believe right and do right. Like,
yeah.
we want both parts of that. And perhaps in this debate, I have an opinion pretty strongly about what the belief and the do is.
Mm,
But I think I want to be careful, and I love your opinion on this, Kelsey. I just want to be careful that even in the difficulty of this conversation around
mm,
abortion, we don't give preeminence to belief over a belief in the political viewpoint
mm.
over the heart posture that follows Jesus. Do you know what I'm saying? Help me process through this.
I
I'm kind of
do,
just,
I
I'm
do, but
verbally
it
vomiting right
raises
now.
the question. No, it's good. It's total. I think we are in human process and modeling human process for the sake of others who are like,
Yeah.
how do we hold these things in tension? Like what I hope that we are doing is engaging transparently to say that this Christian walk is challenging and
Oh,
it is
yeah.
not something that we perfect quickly, immediately, or ever. That it is
Hmm.
a process where we're wrestling with the most important things. And if we truly do believe that image bearers of the Lord have value, then we're treating them that way. And and
Mm-hmm.
and that if the posture of our heart is one of moral superiority because of a certain policy, we are not going to actually be treating image bearers
Yes,
as
I
though they
agree with
have
that.
value. And then that all that it really is abstract. Abstraction is the best way to, we're talking about the baby in the womb as an
Yeah,
abstract concept. And it's
it's not.
obvious that it is merely an abstract concept if we are treating people
Mm,
poorly,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
because our words and our actions and our belief are not integrating.
mm.
As an educator, so this is where I'm going to lean into some of the things that were so redemptive about my seminary days. Is that reminding us was a big part of the mentoring we got, was reminding us that we are heads, hearts, and hands, or minds, hearts, bodies, whatever is the easiest way to help us understand that we're integrated wholes, and that what we believe, what we're thinking, it is
Mhm.
going to flow outward naturally into our actions. So if we are committed to this idea in our heads, if we're truly believing that we are morally superior than that person, then we're going to be Margaret Sanger to that person.
Mm,
We're going to treat them as though they don't have, they're not worthy of walking
yeah.
this earth. And that the baby that we're being morally superior,
I'm
blah,
checking.
blah, blah,
Yeah.
the baby that we're being morally superior about is just an abstraction.
Yeah. We're using the
That's what
child in
I'm
the
saying.
womb as a
Yes.
moral baseball bat that we get to
Right.
swing
Oh,
around and beat up whoever we want and tell them that they're hot garbage because they don't hold our viewpoints. Am I getting this right?
that's exactly right. That's a good way to put it. It's
Yeah,
crass and hard, but
but it's
it's
true.
something that I hope will lodge in our minds that, the same thing for me. I need to confess Kelsey's sin of
Mm,
feeling that, yeah, I've got this thing pretty much figured out,
yeah.
you know? And I'm what do we talk about when we're philosophically we're keeping ourself philosophically, there's no holes, there's no loopholes. I pretty much think that I'm keeping keeping myself pretty together. Ah, there's a
Yeah.
word that I've forgotten, but I think you know what I'm talking
It
about.
makes me
That
think of philosophical integrity. That
that's
there's a
that's
yeah.
one of the words that yes, exactly. And in continuity, there's another word
Mm,
that
mhm,
means
mhm,
that
mhm.
kind of integrity and continuity. And I think I've just used those two words instead, and they work. So the
Mhm.
point is that I am full of cracks. My
Yeah,
thinking is full of cracks. My believing is full of cracks. The way that I act towards my neighbor is broken, full of cracks.
yeah,
And so I appreciate the way that we're bringing policy,
yep,
near. We're having to wrestle with the fact that if we're just hanging our thinking on a policy and getting behind something, it, wait a minute, what is the posture of our heart?
yeah. You said something that I want to repeat as we end our time together because oh
Mm.
my gosh, we're not going to. But if we were to make like a living room disciple voting guide, this would just be the
Mm.
one thing. How does this treat image bearers of God?
Mhm.
You know, like I don't know. You said that, and I just like I think that was so good. And I want to reiterate because it is a passion of mine. There is space for disagreement in this topic, and certainly we'll get to some topics that are just ambiguous as all get out. they're,
Yeah.
they're really
Yeah.
difficult, but I but if we're going into the ballot, we're saying how is this for image bearers of God?
Yeah.
I would personally say in and out of the womb. Um, that I really do believe that the Lord will lead us not just to the right decision or a little circle to fill in, um, but also to the right heart posture.
Yeah.
Um, there's I feel like one boring but also really practical thing that I do think we need to just acknowledge in this
Okay.
conversation. Abortion will probably never be on the ballot in a very literal way in the United States of America. This
Great.
goes back a few episodes when me and Nick were talking
Mm.
about the political system that we have here in the United States. Um, we, being in a democratic republic, not all issues are brought democratically, which means
Mm.
not brought to the ballot. Many issues are resolved in a way that's through the republic systems, or abortion specifically has because legislators have been very hesitant to legislate, it consistently
Yeah.
goes to the courts. And so I just feel like it should be noted that even as we develop our nuanced or firm beliefs on abortion, they actually may not impact how we go to the ballot as much as we think based on the number of times we talk about it as a society.
That's
Um,
true. Yeah.
it
That's a good point.
oftentimes getting to abortion change it can be just if somebody wanted to affect abortion legislation as it stands today in the United States, there's two effective ways, and they're not very effective to elect a president and senators that would put judicial nominees in the Supreme Court, and which is what we saw during the Trump administration, or electing legislators and everyone around the nation will have to elect legislators who would be willing to take up the issue as an amendment to the Constitution, which is so incredibly statistically unlikely that it's,
Right.
I mean, gosh, I never want to say anything's impossible because I feel like I'll
Right.
end up eating my words. But those are really the only two effective ways. We are seeing many states, you'll hear about it in the news all the time because many state legislators are putting forth state legislation, but that can be deceptive because really they're just testing the waters of the judicial system. It's less about the states making laws, which is, it is happening, but it's more about the state legislators constantly sending things up to the Supreme Court to get definitions on the current Supreme Court ruling. So, um, just kind of food for thought that as much as this can feel like the most important topic in the world, from a ballot perspective, how you're going to vote in 2024, it may just be more of a candidate talking point than it is a practical. Would you agree with that, Kelsey?
I would. And if I can,
End us. You got this.
I'm
Final
going to
thoughts.
bring this to that disciple, like, that discipleship perspective. So if this is where discipleship finds a home,
It is.
then let's bring it back to that point of that being the most important work. We may never see
Mm-hmm.
this stuff on the ballot,
Mm-hmm.
but in terms of the effect that we have, the most effective place that we have to engage is in relationship.
Yeah.
And you kind of sold yourself short a little bit ago in this conversation regarding, I mean, the baby's not growing in your body.
Isn't that?
And yet, you're
Mm-hmm.
right. And yet, we are the body.
Yes.
We
Yeah.
are the body, and every one of its members is of vital importance to the other. And in Christ, we have
Mm-hmm.
union with one another.
Yeah.
And so, even if your body isn't the one that is allowed to have that baby knitting together, what you have to say and what you have to do in the lives of your children and the others around you is the most vital work.
Mm.
It's where we as a community image the Lord best because we don't do it just as individuals. We do it as a whole. And so we learn to do that more and more as a whole. And as you speak into my life, thank you. As you speak into your children's, your sons' lives, thank you. So let's do that work of discipleship together, shall we?
Amen.
We're so glad that you were with us today. Thank you for joining us through this tough conversation and hopefully also a conversation that pointed you to the gospel today, as we hope is always on our lips. We have some other people to thank besides our listeners. We want to give thanks to Micah Pop for his production skills and for Eric Church. Thank you for marketing and helping us with getting the word out there. Also, want to hear from you, listener. Thank you for being here. If you want more from us, go to thelivingroomdisciple.com where you can find more of our writing, more of our clips, and more of our episodes. And also, we love your comments or any questions, so feel free to comment away below. Thank you for joining us at the Living Room Disciple Podcast, where discipleship finds a home.